Hi. I'm slightly different from everyone because I'm the guy who doesn't do anything interesting other than manage money. So my name is Jason Sambaju. I'm from Deutsche Bank. My CV will be up in a second. I run the private equity group for Deutsche Bank across Asia. So I'm here to just talk a little bit about private equity. So before my slides go up, what is private equity? It simply means investment into private companies. I think I heard earlier today that there are aspirations to bring new talent, creative industries, technology, and so forth. You can't have those industries without money, and venture capital is very much part of that ecosystem. So if we go to the first slide, this is my background. Sorry, it's a very full slide. The only thing I really want to highlight is two things. First, I've looked at a lot of deal opportunities in my career across many different industries, many of which are probably relevant to Penang: hospitality, healthcare, technology, all of that. And I also have relationships across a very wide spectrum of the private equity ecosystem. And I'd like to highlight here the people at Wald International. These are people who invest, interestingly enough, in semiconductor and some manufacturing. And I'll come back to that in 1 second. The other thing I want to point out is the second bullet point, which is in my career, I've reviewed probably conservatively 300 deal opportunities. Out of those, I've done 8. What it means is you have to do investment, you have to be prepared for failure. That is, without question, the most important thing in stimulating any venture capital is you have to be ready for failure. And that's very important. Next slide, please. So let's put this all into context, okay? And I've got some slides here about what's going on in the world. And this is really relevant, particularly for Penang, because just based on observation and what I know about Penang, and frankly about Malaysia, any venture or private equity industry which is domestically focused is going to be too small. It's not interesting enough for venture capital investors. So Penang, as well as Malaysia, frankly, needs to think globally. You need to address the global market. And what is that? What's going on today in the world? First, there's an energy revolution going on. We've heard it in bits and pieces. And it's driven in large part by two things, really: the decline in oil prices, which is in itself driven by technology. It's the US basically that has become now a net exporter of oil, or could be an exporter of oil, and that's simply because they're fracking. And that's not a curse word, by the way. The other thing is, although in Battlestar Galactica it was a curse word, solar energy and electric vehicles. This is huge. This is transforming cities across the world. And I'll send the slides to you, Lillian, don't worry. Solar energy and electric, big thing right now. And the interesting thing is, and a lot of people don't know this, China is actually a world leader in energy, in new technology for energy. They just do it very quietly. People don't really know about it. But things like hydropower. China is the #1 producer of hydro in the world. It is also a leader in clean coal technology. It is also a leader in fuel cell technology. People don't know this because they don't advertise themselves very well, but that's very important. Another thing, multipolar world. This is no longer, US-centric. Innovation is not US-centric anymore. In fact, you now have, different parts of the world really generating their own economy and their own technology. You have, importantly, China, a rising China that is now becoming increasingly outward-looking, both in terms of wanting to export its own model, its own technology, and frankly, its own money now. So you have things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is about to come up. I think you've seen it in the news. That's a very big deal. And if we're talking about getting people to invest infrastructure, you've got a very large potential investor there. You have a resurgent India. This is very important for Penang also because India wants to make in India. So they are about to basically launch an industrial policy that could potentially rival Penang's manufacturing base. And India has very low wages. And they also have the technology to go with those low wages. I think another important thing to note is actually that there's increasing intra-Asian trade. So as you think about how to develop your startup or creative economy, don't just think about exporting it to the traditional markets of Europe and the US. Asia in itself is becoming a market, and that's very important to think because, in a sense, you're kind of exporting to Asians. You're not having to export to far away, far-flung places anymore. The other thing I would say is really, I mean, we're talking about innovation. There's an acceleration of innovation. There are new ideas of how cities should organize, and I have colleagues who are much more versed in this. But I just want to point out a city called Zhengzhou in China, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. That's a city that basically has decided to build itself around an airport. 5 runways. I mean, that's insane, right? That's huge. But there are new conceptions of how cities can organize themselves and how the entire economy can be built around this new concept. And coming back again to Penang, how can you reorientate your economy around your key strengths, at least what I could see as being key strengths. The final thing is and let's not forget this very important issue. Social issues are becoming increasingly integrated into the way people are thinking about how to run their business, how to manage their business, and how to invest in their business. Nowadays, you can't invest without thinking about things like climate change, social issues, the rights of women and minorities. I mean, these are all part of the branding that you can kind of create around investments in Penang. Next slide, please. Next slide. Richard. Okay, I just want to point out the consumer. Okay, I mean, because this ultimately is, whether you're investing in a manufacturing economy or anything else, ultimately it goes to the consumer. And the important thing is not to talk about the consumer of today. That's people like me. We're the ones who, yes, we are all the ones who are spending today, but you're investing for the future. So what does the future look like? They're called millennials, first of all, and they're very different from us, okay? I just want to highlight the sub-bullets. They've been raised in the digital age. They understand the internet. They live and breathe this stuff, right? In fact, they express themselves through the digital medium. And the other interesting thing about them is they're very different in terms of the way they think about organizing themselves, okay? They're very civic, they're socially liberal, but they're very civic-minded. They're very, very entrepreneurial. In fact, a lot of them are quite iconoclastic. They don't like working for big companies. They are very suspicious of multinationals. And the other thing is they love the lifestyle. They believe in kind of a balanced lifestyle between being able to go out on the beach and getting on the computer and then still doing their work. And that's a very different consumer than the consumer of today. And if you want to build the future of Penang, you have to be thinking about that consumer, not the current consumer. Next slide. So let's just talk a little bit about the private equity landscape. The industry has grown a lot. It's now, I would say, quite mature. And whereas before, a lot of the investors in the private equity space in Asia were Western investors who would come to Asia, nowadays it's actually Asians, again, back to this theme of intra-Asian activity. A lot of private equity investors are actually Asians investing in Asian businesses. They are also becoming very specialized. You actually have funds that specialize in clean technology. You have funds that focus on life sciences. You have funds that actually focus on financial technology. So, in other words, I think you have to get to this mode of thinking that, there are if you can create the opportunity, there is money out there looking for those opportunities. So the most important thing is create the opportunities, and the money will follow. Because generally speaking, as you saw by the statistics earlier on, it's hard to find a good deal. There's a lot of money looking for very few deals. The final thing, another point is private equity moves in clusters. We're very insecure people. We like to talk to each other a lot. We like to cross-reference with each other. So if you want to build a startup creative economy here in Penang, you have to create that feeling of a cluster. And interestingly, of course, you have that in spades. I mean, you have this amazing asset called the Georgetown Heritage Area, which right now feels very much like a cluster. I mean, we were going around in rickshaws yesterday, and you get this real sense of place, which I think many cities do not have. The final thing is impact investing and social innovation. This goes back to the point that I was talking about earlier, which is the average consumer tomorrow really cares about what he does, or she does. He really cares that when he buys a t-shirt, that it's made somewhere sustainably, that it's not some child labor that's being used for it, that is being transported in a sustainable way. He cares about what he eats, or she eats. And so, that's trickling through even into the private equity community. There are private equity firms today that focus on social innovation. There are private equity firms that even say, you know what, we're not going to deliver purely financial returns. We're going to give you X% financial returns, but we'll also give you more, which is what we invest in has a social impact. And don't underestimate the size of this market. The Acumen Fund, which is the most famous of these social innovation funds, manages $1.5 billion today, based out of the UK. And they make small investments, anywhere between $1 million to $5 million. But you know, they've got scale. Next. So, what do we care about? You know, people like me. You know, I wanted, before getting into the long list of things, I just want to highlight, first and foremost, we love risk. That's what we do, okay? Never underestimate that. We're often the first people in doing the craziest type of investments. If you target yourself to the right type of investors, you will find them. And they are willing to take risks because that's what they get paid to do. Because with risk comes return. All of the other factors, you know, I think this you probably heard before, but you know, you need to have a politically stable environment, one where the economic policy is pretty clear. Malaysia has that. Penang has that. Growth and scalability. I mean, that's very important, especially for startup investors. They want to see that what they're investing in has the chance to grow, because ultimately, and this is the final point, they need to exit the investments. We are financial investors. We don't stay there forever. We invest in a company to generate returns, whether it's just purely financial or financial plus social. We need to get out of the investment. I know that's an issue for Malaysia, and that has been traditionally an issue, and in fact, that's been one of the reasons why Malaysia, as far as the penetration of private equity relative to places like Singapore or Hong Kong or China, is relatively low, because Malaysia has made it very difficult to exit out of investments. And we can talk about some of the affirmative action policies, but there are ways around that, perhaps, and something to talk about, think about, but that's a real issue, because you need to get out of investment to be able to generate returns. Final slide. Okay, so why? why bother? Why think about having private equity investors? Well, it's because, as I said earlier, we often go where no one else will go. And in many ways, we create a wedge for long-term capital. You know, we work often with strategic investors. Very often, we exit to strategic investors. In others, we sell the companies that we invest in to strategic investors. Second, you know, we actually know what we're doing, generally speaking. You know, when we make an investment, we go through a very thorough and very rigorous due diligence process. And that process in itself can actually validate the investment case for, well, not only for a particular company, but you know, certainly for even a city or a country. Good private equity investors actually do add value. A lot of them have excellent sectoral experience. They bring international perspective, both inwardly as well as outwardly. In other words, they can help companies go abroad. Very often, these private equity investors will have 50 or 60 companies in their portfolio, so they can basically help synergize with other companies within their portfolio when they make an investment. The final thing is they bring global best practices. That's what we get paid for. We come into an investment and we look at how we can add value, how we can implement change in terms of management, in terms of governance, and other operational activities. The final thing is, I think it's very good for Penang's branding to have a vibrant investment community, because it actually shows that there is real economic activity going on. So, you know, I think as you think about how to orientate yourself, how to create the sense of economic place, you know, having that kind of investment community, even though it's very often thought of as portfolio investment, can actually add to your branding. The final thing I wanted to do, I have a minute? So I was just kind of, you know, thinking about, you know, some ideas in terms of, you know, what, and my phone could. Okay, my phone has jammed up. It's decided not to work, which goes to show that I'm probably not a very good. Okay, anyway, I'll just go off the top of my head. I mean, when I think about Penang, and when I think about, you know, where it can, how it can develop a kind of a community of investing and startups and so forth, funny enough, the city I think of, and I'm going to be bold here, is San Francisco. Okay, you have so many of the similar elements, right? You have, you have an educational institution that almost any startup / venture capital community requires that element of the academic, right? Of course, USM is not Stanford, but it's a start. The second thing is you actually have a manufacturing economy. And it's in actually areas which in the future actually have derivatives that could be a lot more interesting for investment. For example, semiconductors. The next generation of semiconductor investing is actually in fabless design. In other words, these are groups that actually set up architecture for semiconductors, but they don't actually manufacture themselves. That's an area that you could consider. I mean, another area you could consider is the solar. I mean, that's another area where you can, again, go to the higher value add services rather than really the capital-intensive manufacturing type of things. So how do you create that community? It doesn't happen overnight. Well, a couple of things. I think you kind of have to invest in the hardware. That's inevitable, right? If you don't have the hardware like internet connectivity, it's very hard for startups, for creative industries to really get engaged because they need that connectivity with the world. I think there is, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a real great opportunity to have Georgetown, the heritage area, become the hub of a startup / creative economy. And there are many ways you can incentivize startups to come here, because one thing that startups generally are is that they're broke, and they need help. They need help to find a space to work. They need places to collaborate. So that's something that, again, I think you can look at, and it's got this sense of cool, which I think a lot of cities don't have. So, as I think about like the opportunities for Penang, I think it's great that the different departments are talking here, because I think a combination of all of these different departments could really help to start to create that kind of new economy feel. And I think once you create that new economy feel, naturally the talent will be attracted and come back. So, anyway. Sorry, any questions?
Surprisingly, we are really not behind time. We thought we were going to be far more behind time. We're only about 20 minutes behind. There's one thing I want to ask you. If we don't mind, we make our coffee break a little bit shorter. Jason, now I'm convinced you're a banker, because we know each other so much under creativity, innovation, ecosystem. I want to ask you a question. Would you, because you're so scrutinizing the investment, would you mentor and coach investment seeking program, system, projects, ideas? Would you coach them? Would you mentor them?
You as in me, or you as in the community?
You as in you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I really enjoy that, in fact. So, I think, as I think about, my career, I've been in this for 18 years, and I've, developed, I guess, some track record around investments, and I've also developed a relationship with many VCs. I think about, what can I do with that, right? I mean, it's interesting to do good deals, but, I think it's much more interesting to take that knowledge and that network and really, have, I guess, a more meaningful impact. So, if I could be engaged, I'd be happy to.
Thank you. I'll definitely take you up on that. We do have our VC community is not very structured, not very big, because a lot of our industries is not very scalable as it is. But we do have a community of angel capitalists.
Okay.
And a lot of them are local businesses who have made it big here. Right. Now, the question that I have for you, and this is something more personal maybe, but also on a very much discussion level. If you go back to your you have one, the Gen Y and the Millennium.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm beyond that. So Gen X. Sorry.
Yeah.
So my question is that startup versus Siemens.
Okay. Siemens, the German company.
German company.
Yeah.
But, what is it? B&B versus Hilton.
Airbnb versus Hilton, yeah.
Versus
Yeah.
Hilton. So, you know, that comparison, startup technology versus asset base, right? That's a question that we've been struggling around, me in particular, and also, I mean, startups is a great thing, and I see everybody's plunging into it, right? But that question's in my mind. Siemens has been here for, what, 150 years?
Yeah.
Startups have a 36 months,
Yeah.
you know, exit plan. So
Yeah.
how do you reconcile that too? And what is sustainable, or what is...
Well, you know, every Siemens started as a startup, you know, and every, you know, Hilton started as an Airbnb type, although not exactly the same. I mean, I think it comes down to this tolerance for failure. You know, I think you have to be prepared to see that money will go to places where they'll just disappear. But, you know, the reason why it disappears is because that knowledge accumulates in a non-financial way. And once, when you do have that cluster, that knowledge actually stays within that community. That's why actually clustering is so important for the venture communities, because I think if you look at the statistics, 90% of startups fail, 90%. But of the 10% of startups that fail, the success rate in the second time an entrepreneur starts out is actually 50%. And if they fail for a second time and they go the third time, the success rate becomes 80%. So there is an actual accumulation of knowledge. And as you know, and I think that's where a lot of places struggle to make the transition from the old economy to the new economy, is because they have a very different conception of of failure. The fortunate thing, and this is where, you know, I'm not a millennial myself, I'm actually technically a Gen Xer, but I am married to a millennial. It's interesting because they, by their nature, for some reason, they just love failure. I mean, these you know, these younger kids, you know, they're very entrepreneurial in that sense, and they don't see they see failure as a badge of honor, and that's, frankly, I think that's great, because I think, you know, where we're going, I mean, if what we're going to be investing in is just the physical space that we have, you know, we're gonna bleed ourselves dry, right? I mean, we need to find ways of adding more value per square foot of land, so to say, or per square foot of real estate. And the way you do that is to build knowledge. And the unfortunate thing is, knowledge doesn't necessarily accumulate in a dollar form until you have those big winners. So, you know, I think in a sense, you know, to come back to your question of how do you think about these two things, you know, just, you know, put aside a piece of land, let them kind of figure it out, and amazingly, somewhere from some of that kind of soup, you know, some success will start to come through. But, you know, it needs patience, time, and willingness to see failure, and not be judged by it, I guess. Yep.
You mentioned about the private equity being a possibility in Penang. What do you think in terms of Penang being a secondary city, and that financial expertise usually agglomerate in large capital cities like Singapore, Hong Kong, London, New York?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why is because Penang doesn't have a capital market, right? I mean, and this goes back to the point that I made about exit. Unless you can exit an investment, it's very hard to invest in a place. But, you know, there are ways of managing around that. You know, you can set up through trains. For example, you know, if Penang was to collaborate with a major stock exchange, and I won't name names, but maybe, you know, maybe the one in KL is not the right one, but, you know, like what, you know, and set up a collaboration whereby, you know, you encourage the development of companies that meet the listing requirements of, for example, Singapore, so that they can ultimately list in Singapore. Because the thing about financial capital is that it doesn't really care where the company is based. Where it cares about is where the companies sell to, and whether or not that's something that stock exchange understands. So, for example, in Singapore today, you have Indonesian companies listed there, you have Indian companies listed there, you have Chinese companies listed there. As long as the investors in that market understand what they're investing in, it doesn't matter where the company is based. So I think, you know, to your point, Kim Hua, I think, yes, Penang doesn't have a stock exchange. Ideally, it would. Well, actually, maybe not ideally, because if it has its own stock exchange, it's probably going to be subsized, frankly. So, you know, there are other ways of setting up, kind of creative ways of setting up a system whereby companies which are based in Penang get to attract private equity investment from other parts of the world. and the region is a very good place to start, and ultimately exit somewhere else. So this just can be the hub. This can be the physical space, and like I said, you guys have one of the best assets I've seen in a long time in terms of, I mean, I can see, young guys coming in here and feeling very excited about, being in this heritage area and doing something with it. Because they're very creative. I'm not creative enough to know what they can do.
Great. Thank you. Once again, thank you very much. Thanks, Jason.